Now, if you have followed this lecture series until here, you will know that we are almost at the end of the sessions. We have done all the hard work, we have done the analysis, we have thought about the strategy, we have carefully applied the frameworks, we have written our strategy paper, and in the last session we also developed a financial plan and a budget. Now there's only one element left that we have to look at, and that is the element of organizational design, getting the organization ready for the strategy that we have prepared. And this is what we are going to talk about in today's session. Now, in this session, we will cover a couple of elements. The first is we will talk about why is it so important that we think about organization design and getting the organization ready. Then we will look at some of the organization designs and org structures that help facilitate the strategy implementation. Third, we will look at change management, because a lot of time strategy involves major change for the organization. So we will look at approaches to change management. And then I want to end with a short note about ethics and ethical implementation of strategies. We have a whole separate session dedicated to the topic of ethics, so I only want to touch this very briefly today. So let's go into it. To explain why organizational configuration is so important, I would like to look at McKinsey's 7S framework. So first of all, what is organizational configuration? Organizational configuration is the set of organizational design elements that interlink in order to support the intended strategy. So we design an organization that in the end helps us implement our strategy and make the strategy successful. The goal, of course, is to ensure that the organization's goal, strategy, structure, systems, and other important elements are aligned and are compatible with the strategy. And a couple of decades ago by now, McKinsey came up with a framework that outlines all these important elements, and this is McKinsey's 7S framework. The starting point is in the middle, the superordinate goals. These are the vision, the mission, and the objectives that the organization has set for themselves. And that is supported by the 6 elements that are surrounding those superordinate goals. So the strategy, which is the major part of this lecture series anyway. Then also the structure of the organization, the systems that the organization has in place, the style, which refers to the leadership style of the top management and the management at large, skills and capabilities of the organization, and then the staff, people in the organization. A little explanation of some of these elements. Superordinate goals, as I mentioned already, are the overarching goals or the purpose of the organization as a whole. So this includes the vision, the mission, and the objective. All of these form the organizational purpose. And these superordinate goals are at the center of the 7S framework. All other elements should support these superordinate goals. Another one that might need a little bit more explanation is style. So style is, as I also mentioned already, the leadership style of the top managers. And what is important here is that the style, the leadership style of management should fit the other aspects of the 7S framework. For example, if you have a very highly directive or coercive style, it might not fit very well with a matrix organization. So the organization design and leadership style have to match each other. Staff is the kinds of people that are in the organization. Staff here touches on most of the elements of the HR system, of the human resource system. That includes recruitment, it includes the onboarding, training, rewards. And the key question here is, does the organization have the right people that actually match with the strategy? The last element that I would like to touch upon a little bit in more detail is skills. So skills here refers actually to organizational capabilities. So how are basically the individual talents and the individual capabilities and skills of the people in the organization used and transformed into organizational capabilities that are aligned with the strategy. So with this 7S framework, there are a couple of implications on how we do the organizational design. The first is that building an organization design involves a lot more than just getting the structure right. So we need to think about all the other elements of the 7S framework in order to design the right organization that fits our strategy and our superordinate goals. The second implication is that all elements need to fit with each other. They need to be aligned with each other, and they are connected together. And the implication of that is that if we change one element of the 7S framework, then it's very likely that we have to make changes to other elements as well. For example, if we change the strategy, we need to look at all the other 6 elements and need to see whether everything is still in line with the strategy and whether the strategy actually can be successful. So we can't look at one element in isolation. We always need to look at all the 7 together. Now, this should highlight why is it so important that we have to talk about organization design in the context of strategy implementation. Next, I would like to touch upon some of those organization designs. And a couple of years ago, this is now already 35 years ago, there has been some research about how large organizations actually develop and how they grow and how the organization structure changes accordingly. Most organizations start with a simple structure where the owner surrounds himself, herself with a number of people that support the organization in the very early stages. Now, as the organization grows in revenues and as more employees join the organization accordingly, a different structure is required, and that is typically a functional structure. Now, the organization grows further, and typically what happens then is there's diversification into related products, so that more products are being launched, or maybe an internationalization where other markets are being explored. That then leads to a divisional structure. And from that divisional structure, there might be additional expansion, international expansion. It can lead to an international structure. Now, I will explain the structures on the next slides that follow. But just to explain this chart here, the bold arrows are typically the strategic paths that organizations in the US have taken over the past couple of years. And the thinner arrows are the strategies that can be applied in order to get from one of the structures to the other structure. Now, what happens sometimes is that the organization does not move directly from a functional structure to a divisional structure by diversification or by adding more products. Sometimes there's also vertical integration. So along the supply chain, for example, we acquire a supplier or we integrate other parts of the supply chain. That also might lead to a functional structure. The functional structure can be maintained in that case. And if we diversify further, then that leads to a divisional structure. So for a divisional structure to happen, typically we need some level of diversification for it to make sense. And of course, international expansion can also happen after a functional structure has been put in place, and that then would lead to a worldwide functional structure. That assumes that there's no further diversification happening. There's also another pathway which is taken when the company decides to diversify into unrelated areas, so into a kind of conglomerate structure. Then that leads to a holding company structure, and with international expansion that might lead into a worldwide holding company structure. So these are the different pathways that an organization can take in order to grow, and the organizational structure that follows accordingly. Now, I would like to look at the middle path and the structures that are highlighted here in bright blue in a little bit more detail. So let's start with a simple structure. When the organization is still young, basically has just developed a startup, typically we have a very simple structure where there's an owner or top executive, and this owner surrounds himself or herself with a number of employees. So this is most common in organizations that have simple product lines, maybe just one product line, and typically not more than 15 employees. In this case, the owner, manager, or the top executive makes most of the decisions and controls all the activities. The staff that we have here, the employees, they serve basically as an extension to the top executive. Now, as the organization grows, we need more specialized resources, and that is happening here. So here we have a chief executive at the top, and then we have functional managers, specialized managers that report into the chief executive. And one level below, we have lower level managers, specialists, operating staff that supports those managers and reports into those managers. Now, in a functional org structure, those major functions are grouped internally. And this typically happens when we have closely related products and services. So no major diversification yet. Vertically integrated structure is also possible. The chief executive's most important responsibility here is to coordinate and integrate the different functional areas in order to avoid functional silos. Now, the next structure, once we diversify, we grow into different types of businesses, we have some related diversification or also international expansion, we might come to a divisional structure. So in this case, we have a division general manager, and he has the same functions reporting into him or her as on the previous slide, the chief executive, but with the difference that here we have other divisions as well. So this structure is basically replicated across the different business lines. So if you see it, if you look at division A, could be one business line. Division B is a totally different division, totally different business line. So each division basically has its own functional specialists who are organized into their departments as in the previous functional structure. And in this case, also each operating division is relatively autonomous. All the functions are there. You see it here. The production is there, engineering, marketing, personnel, HR, accounting, all reports into the general manager. And they're fairly independent in their decision making. But the overall governance still sits with the central corporate office, with the chief executives and the corporate staff that coordinates across the divisions. So that's the divisional structure. Finally, for more complex situations where we have different geographies, different product lines, we might end up in a matrix structure. So in a matrix structure, it basically combines the functional and the divisional structures. Now, some individuals here will report to two different managers, to their functional managers along the y-axis and to the project managers in this case, or geographic managers along the x-axis. So as I indicated already, there's two main use cases for this kind of structure. One is projects. So staff from functional departments, they work on a project, and therefore for that time, in addition to their functional managers, they might report into a project manager for that specific project. The same can also be applied for geographical units. So in this case, we have product managers that have global responsibility for their product line. And at the same time, we also have regional managers, and they have responsibility for the profitability of the business in their region. Now, the beauty of this structure is that it provides quite a good deal of flexibility in terms of working on projects, in terms of working on geographical assignments, while at the same time maintaining this kind of functional structure. So you get the best of both. Now, briefly about the advantages and disadvantages of each of those org structures, starting with the functional structure. A functional structure is great because you have a pool of specialists, and that also helps coordinating those specialists and controlling them. You have centralized decision making that helps with all kind of organizational perspectives, or giving an organizational perspective across all the functions. And career paths are very easily defined. You have professional development in the specialized areas. You grow in your function, basically. Now, the disadvantages of a functional structure is that sometimes we end up in functional silos, and that might prevent good communication and coordination across those functions. Also, sometimes these specialists in each of the functions have a tendency to develop more like a short-term perspective and focus only on their function, see only the narrow picture rather than the bigger picture of the company. Sometimes also there might be conflicts between different functions, and this might put a burden on the top-level decision makers. And it's quite difficult to establish performance standards across the different functions because they're quite different in their tasks and how they work. Now, the divisional structure. Here we have increased control, and we allow the corporate executives to address strategic issues and control the divisions. A divisional structure is also quite quick in responding to environmental changes. We have increased focus on products and markets at the same time. Resources are relatively easily shared across the functional areas, and also divisional structures facilitate the development of general managers. Because in each division we have a strong general manager, and if we do proper succession planning and coaching and training of the people that report into this general manager, we have a constant pipeline of good general managers for the company. Now, the downside of a divisional structure is that you have quite a bit of cost duplicated, because we basically have the same kind of personnel, operations, finance people duplicated in each of the divisions. Sometimes this might also lead to a not so functional competition among divisions, so they compete against each other rather than working together. And this might actually distract from the overall performance of the company and from the overall goal that the company is pursuing. With very different divisions, it might sometimes be very difficult to maintain a uniform corporate image, especially when there's a great level of diversification and the corporate divisions are quite different in their field of business. That might create a different culture also, and a completely different image. And divisions might overemphasize the short-term performance rather than the longer-term performance of the company overall. Finally, with the matrix structure, here we have increased market responsiveness because we have collaboration, we have a lot of synergies, we have quite good communication also. Resources are used quite efficiently because we always look at the two dimensions, the functional and the divisional structures, and bring them together. And also in terms of professional development, it gives a lot of possibilities and opportunities to people to shape their careers. Now, the downside of the matrix structure is that this dual reporting can be confusing at times. It can bring some uncertainty with regards to who is accountable. Sometimes we have power struggles, especially if there's a divisional leader and a functional leader, and they both want to give directions to the team underneath them. And if these directions are in conflict with each other, you can imagine that there's a lot of conflict in the organization and difficulty for the staff that has to report now to two managers that are in conflict with each other. Working relationships are obviously much more complicated, especially with two bosses that everyone has, and also the human resource process is a little bit more complicated. And we have to rely on teamwork. We have some coordination that is needed between the functional and the divisional managers, and that sometimes might slow down decision making. Now, these were the main organizational structures. There's other structural designs that can be applied, but the ones that we touched upon here are the main ones. And as the organization grows, obviously the structure becomes more complex as well. So next, I would like to talk a little bit about change management. Because very often when we implement a strategy, we take the company into a different direction, and this requires a level of change. And I would like to touch upon this for a bit. Now, Balogun and Halley have come up with a framework that talks about 4 generic types of strategic change. And they looked at it in 2 dimensions. On the one axis, the y-axis here, what is the nature of that change? Is that change that is required incremental? So are there small changes to be made? Or is it a big bang? So major changes required as part of the strategy implementation. And then the extent of that change. So is it just a realignment that is needed? So is the current situation already quite good and quite stable? So can we just realign and reshape a little bit here? Or is it a transformation, like a real big change? If the nature of the change is incremental, so just small changes, and it basically allows to use the existing culture, the existing structure, then we just need an adaptation. So that's a very small incremental change and basically building on what we already have. If we cannot use what we already have, if we need to move on from the current organizational culture and the current organization design, then we need some kind of evolution. Now, the nature of the change is still incremental, so we will make small steps towards our goal, but the goal itself is transformative. So it's a major change to where we stand today. So that's an evolution. If we can use the current structure, the current culture, but we need to do it in a big bang, in a big way, because, for example, the company is in financial trouble, then we need what is called reconstruction, or also called a turnaround. We need a major turnaround. And finally, if we cannot use the existing culture, we need to change the culture, and we need to make a major change in terms of strategy, then we need a revolution. So let me talk about 3 of those 4 elements a little bit in more detail, starting with evolution. So evolution means we have an incremental transformation, and this incremental transformation can be achieved in 2 ways. The first is organizational ambidexterity. What does it mean? Ambidexterity means we exploit the existing capabilities, but at the same time, we also need to explore new capabilities. So a change is required, but we still can rely on the existing capabilities, for example, to help fund major initiatives that bring us to new capabilities. So a couple of elements under this organizational ambidexterity. The first is structural ambidexterity. Here, we maintain the core, but we create separate small teams. So we change the organizational structure by creating several small teams that help with the exploration of new areas. Another aspect of this approach is that we need diversity rather than conformity. So here, the top management has to ensure that we have a diversity of managers' experience and that we encourage debate about future strategies. So we want the diversity, and we want people to express their opinions. Now, the role of leadership in this approach is that leadership has to permanently balance encouragement, new ideas, experiments, but also have the authority, legitimacy, and the recognition that is needed to really steer the organization. And that's a fine balance that we have to strike here. And finally, we need tight and loose systems. So the current, exploiting the current existing capabilities needs a tight system, and the exploration, the experimentation needs a looser system. And the glue between the two is a clear strategic intent, and that has to be expressed by the top management. Now, another way to think about evolution is by looking at the stages of strategic change. So that includes defining stages of transition, so small interim stages that bring us from where we are today to the transformation that we need in the future. Another element here that might be helpful is to define irreversible changes. So make some changes, for example, a new IT system that is very difficult to reverse. So we might not see an impact immediately, but because it takes time to build this IT system. But once the IT system is in place, these changes will be irreversible and there will be long-term impact from this. This definitely requires sustained top management commitment and requires that everyone is aligned and supports the transformation. And it also involves winning hearts and minds. So culture change, which is needed in this case, but that culture change should happen through persuasion and participation. So that's the element of evolution. Then the second is the reconstruction or the turnaround strategy. Here we talk about change that may be very speedy, very fast, very rapid, and that involves an upheaval in the organization. But it does not fundamentally change the culture or the business model of the organization. So it's not transformative in that sense. This typically happens when there's a crisis situation. And some elements of this turnaround strategy is first the crisis stabilization. So for management to regain control over the system, for example, focusing on cost reduction, focusing on revenue increases, focusing on productivity improvement, tight financial control, with a focus of rapid execution, so fast execution. The next is management changes. So typically in these turnaround situations, management changes are required. Management in top management, sales, marketing management, and finance management. And the reasons for this is that, well, for one, the old management may actually have been the cause of the problems that require the turnaround in the first place. Second, typically these turnaround situations require to bring in some management with the necessary experience. And finally, having a new management in place also brings in new perspectives, new approaches that will help the organization to move forward and change the way the organization operates. Another element that is important to turnaround strategies is to gain stakeholder support. So it's very critical that key stakeholders like employees, shareholders, banks are kept in the loop of what's going on. And especially as improvements are made, that they are informed about those improvements. A turnaround strategy also might require to clarify again what the target market is and the core products are. One of the key elements here is to get closer to the customer and also improving the flow of the marketing information, marketing communication. And as this is critical, it might need some clarification of or some reminder of what the target markets are and what the core products in those markets are to refocus the organization. And finally, turnaround strategies typically require financial restructuring. So this might include the capital structure, it might include raising additional funds. It might also include renegotiating some of the terms and conditions and the agreements that we have with creditors, with banks, and so on. So that's a turnaround. Again, a turnaround is a rapid change, a major change, but it doesn't change the organization culture. It doesn't change the business model. So in that far, it is not transformative in that sense. Finally, the most radical and most transformative type of change, which is revolution. So revolution is also the most challenging type of strategic change because it involves rapid cultural change. And at the same time, the need for change may not be evident to the people in the organization. Therefore, major cultural changes is required. A cultural shift is required. And leading this kind of revolution may involve things like setting a new, clear strategic direction and articulate very clearly what the direction is. And here's where the CEO can really shine and can really make a major difference. Then, again, a revolution might require top management changes. Maybe because the existing management might be linked to the past culture, and there might be networks of colleagues, customers, suppliers that are in place and that need to be disrupted. And this change in top management might also send a very clear signal of the significance of the change to the organization and might actually help to drive the cultural change. Revolution typically also needs multiple styles of change management. Definitely a revolution needs a directive style, which is a prevalent style in this kind of strategic change. But it also needs to be mixed with elements of persuasion, participation, in order to overcome the resistance to change. Again, I mentioned already a cultural change is required, so we need to look at the forces that are in place that are useful of the existing culture and those elements that are hindering the change that we want to drive. And we need to do something about it, which I will talk about on the next slide. And finally, this change, revolutionary change, needs to be monitored. So constantly we need to set goals. We need to set very clear, unambiguous targets and monitor those targets and ensure that people actually do achieve those targets. Now, with regards to culture change, just a quick note. A useful tool here is a so-called Forcefield analysis. So Forcefield analysis gives us a perspective on the forces that are at work in an organization and that either helps or prevents the change that we want to drive in the organization. And there's 3 questions that we need to ask ourselves in this Forcefield analysis. The first question is, what aspect of the current situation are actually blocking change? And what do we need to do to overcome those blockage points? The second question is, what aspects of the organization actually are helpful? And how can we reinforce these helpful elements of the current culture in the organization? And finally, what else do we need to add? What needs to be introduced? What needs to be added to aid change? And here's an example of Forcefield analysis. So the green elements here highlighted in green are elements that are pushing, so positive elements that help the change. The red ones are the ones that are resisting, and the blue one is some additional elements that might help in driving the change. So that's a framework that helps us, especially in situations where we need a revolution and where the strategy that we set is revolutionary to the organization. Now, finally, I would like to talk a bit about ethics. Again, there's a whole separate session dedicated to the aspect of business ethics, but I would like to end this session when we talk about organizational design and organizational controls with a quick explanation on ethics. Starting off with the definition. So ethics is a system of right and wrong that assists individuals in making decisions, in deciding whether what they are doing is moral or immoral, if it's good or bad, if it's socially desirable or not. Now, organization ethics are those ethical guidelines for an organization. So the values, the attitudes, the behavioral patterns that define what is the operating culture of the organization and that help us determine what an organization holds as acceptable behavior. So it's a clear definition of what behaviors are acceptable in the organization and which behaviors are not acceptable in the organization. And ethical orientation, these are the practices that the firm uses to promote an ethical business culture. Now, there are two types of approaches in ethics management. One is called the compliance-based approach, and the other one is called the integrity-based approach. Let me talk about the compliance-based approach first. Now, the ethos here behind this approach is that we need to be conform, and all employees need to be conform with standards that are imposed from externally, for example, by lawyers or by the society in general. So the standard here for the organization comes from external sources. The objective is we want to prevent any misconduct, criminal misconduct, for example. We want to prevent the organization and people in the organization from getting into trouble. The leadership in this case, the ones who define what is ethical and what is not, are typically lawyers or external advisors. The methods that we can use here is, of course, education, so training. We limit the amount of discretion, the decision power that people have. We do auditing, we do controls, and we have strict penalties in place. The assumption behind this compliance-based approach is that we have autonomous beings, so people that act on their own, but they need to be guided by material self-interest, which means like avoiding penalties and maybe getting rewards for proper ethical behavior. Now, that approach is quite directive and quite controlling. That is opposed to the integrity-based approach. In the integrity-based approach, the ethos behind the approach is that people are self-governed and they manage to conduct themselves according to standards that are chosen by the organization, not externally, but by the organization from within. The objective here is to enable a conduct that is responsible and in line with the expectations that the organization has developed. Leadership here is really management-driven. Lawyers might aid this process, HR might aid this process, others, external advisors and so on, might be supporting this, but it's really management-driven. The methods here are, again, like education, so training and information leadership, but also accountability, organizational systems and decision processes. We also have auditing and controls and penalties, but it is much more self-controlling and people have more accountability. And the behavioral assumptions behind this is that people in the organization are social beings and they can be guided, of course, by material self-interest, but also by values, by ideals, by peers, by role models. And this approach, this integrity-based approach, is basically the basis for the next session. So I don't want to talk about it in this session. I want to talk a little bit about the compliance-based approach, at least. So there's 4 elements that need to be in place in order to ensure that this compliance-based approach works. And to be frank, in most industry organizations that I have worked in, this compliance-based approach is applied. An example of the other approach would be consulting companies, for example, McKinsey, that applies a more self-responsible approach. Now, in order for a compliance-based approach to work, we need those 4 elements that are listed here. First, we need strong role models. So it works only if the top management also acts in the same way that is expected from their staff. Then the second element is corporate credos, codes of conduct. So it needs to be very clearly defined what is acceptable and what is not. It needs to be written down and made available. Typically, this comes at the beginning of an employee relationship when the employment contract is signed. The code of conduct is typically an addendum to the employment contract. Then it also needs a reward and positive and negative, so also a penalty system and an evaluation system that controls that behavior and takes actions positive if the behavior is positive and negative, like penalties, if the behavior has been negative. And finally, the organization needs clear policies and procedures of what to do if there's a transgression, meaning if there's a misbehavior and misconduct, what will happen, what are the policies in this case, and what procedures, what actions do we take, maybe from an HR perspective, in order to correct the situation. So this concludes the lecture on organizational structure, organizational design, and controls. And we ended with the aspect of ethics. So in the next session, we will go much deeper into this last aspect of ethics. I think it's really important for companies to behave ethical, and it is getting more and more important as we have social media and much more scrutiny also from the public on how organizations behave. And I'm a big believer into the importance of ethical behavior, especially in the long term, in the long run. But in the short run, organizations might get away with a lot of things. In the long run, they typically do not. So behaving ethically and making this part of the strategy is very important. And that's why a full session dedicated to this in the next session.